Okay,
Oh, live.
you're apparently
Yes.
live.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yes. Hi, I'm Heather Ross. I'm at the University of Saskatchewan and one of the instructors for Introduction to Learning Technologies, and this is our first Google Hangout of the course for this year. Today is January 15th, 2015, and I am here with my co-teacher, Ryan Bano. Brave Ryan.
Hello.
And we are joined by our special guest today, David White, who is, I want to get this right, Head of Technology Enhanced Learning at University of Arts, London. Thank you for
Yes.
joining us, David.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you.
For those of you who are joining us from the course, welcome. We're glad that you're here. For anybody else who happens to be seeing this, this is an open course being offered from the Gwenemaw Center for Teaching Effectiveness at the University of Saskatchewan. As of this morning, I checked, and we have just over 1,600 people registered in the course from more than 35 countries, which is very exciting for us. And our discussion boards have been very active, and as has the Twitter channel. If you have any questions during this this broadcast, you can use the hashtag on Twitter. It's ILT for Introduction to Learning Technologies _ USASK for USask. So hashtag ILT _ USask. So to get started, this is what the format's going to be. David's going to give us a little bit of background, the work he does around digital visitors and residents. And then we're going to ask him some questions that have been sent in from students in the class on the discussion forums and any that pop up on the Twitter hashtag. There were a lot of questions. We are not going to get to all of them, but
Okay.
we will do our best.
I can talk pretty quickly.
So, David, do you want to start by giving us some background on what your work around digital visitors and digital residents?
Okay, yeah. I won't take up too much time because I think this is sort of in a flipped mode, isn't it? If you can call it flipped, if you're anyway, I don't know. But obviously, there's quite a lot of visitor resident material out there. I mean, originally, what happened was that I did a small amount of research where I was interviewing people on online distance courses that we were running out of Oxford at the time, and it struck me that there were two quite distinct sort of attitudes towards the web, and one of them was that I'd use it as an information source, but basically I'll do all of my work offline and I'll just grab stuff from like it's a library almost. And the other one was people who were quite happy with going into social media, chatting, connecting with people, all of these sort of things. And it struck me that some people were living out part of their life online and other people were, as I say, just visiting the web, and that's where the idea of visitors and residents came from. It was also influenced by work I was doing in Second Life at the time, and when you got a profile in Second Life they'd call you a resident, and it struck me that that idea that the digital could be a place where you actually live, sort of Sherry Turkle style thing, would sort of resonated with me, and it was an attempt to kind of move on from Prensky's notions of digital immigrants and digital natives, which just didn't feel like it was representing the truth of what was going on, and just felt like it was projecting a sort of generation gap that was perhaps something that was easy to believe in, but whether it was actually taking place or not is difficult to say. And so very quickly, it's a continuum of modes of engagement online. So it's not about how good you are with technology, it's about your motivation to actually go online. You know, what are you thinking about when you sit down at your laptop, when you get your mobile phone out? Why are you going online? And it's not two people. I think I have to be very clear about that. So you're not a visitor or a resident. It is, as I say, modes, and most people will operate in you know, a variety of those modes somewhere along that continuum at different times. So I'm very resident professionally, but I'm not very resident with my personal life. And obviously, I use the web all the time to Google, Wikipedia, do my banking, and all the rest of it. So I operate in a visitor mode as well. And I think that the easiest way to characterize well, visitor is literally you go online, you do what you need to do, you come away again. So that's quite obvious because that's kind of a standard sort of paradigm. I think the resident end of the continuum is perhaps more subtle in some ways. I always describe extreme residency as being almost about visibility. So you could kind of identify whether you're in extreme resident mode because it's something that anybody can Google to. to like my Twitter stream is extremely resident. I think there's a quite a subtle middle ground where a lot of people spend their time, which is when you're engaging online and you're leaving a social trace and you're expressing yourself and you have a digital identity, but you're doing that within a known community. So, for instance, being really active on an email list that's around a hobby or around an interest, that's you expressing your opinion, you're leaving a trace behind, but it's obviously within a community that's got an edge to it. So you are being resident, but you're not being that sort of super resident, super visible. And I wonder, it's very difficult to tell, what are the proportions of activity out there online? I suspect, for example, even in something like Facebook, an awful lot of what's happening there is private. So it's resident, but relatively private. It's two people IMing each other via Facebook chat. You think about WhatsApp. It's another example of a very, very fluid grouping technology. So while the people in there are being resident to a certain extent because they're very much expressing themselves, they're still within a kind of safe space. So there are these different levels to it, which is why I say it's a sliding scale. So that's a kind of a brief overview. I've used that quite a lot to help me come to an understanding of how people engage online, especially in the context of learning. But obviously, you can use it in a more broad way than that. So I'll stop there. Is that enough detail at that point?
Yeah, I think that's great. Most people, as I said, if they're in the class, they're supposed to have already watched the videos of you and actually done the mapping activity and posted their thoughts on that on the discussion forum. So let's get started with some of the questions we got. This one was from Lindsay, and Lindsay asked, how do you, quote, convince older teachers that they can use technology effectively? And I read this question in the context of the stuff from Prensky that they keep hearing about, you're digital immigrants, you can't do this.
Right. Yeah, and I presume that Lindsay would be talking about in a kind of educational context there. I mean, yeah, firstly, I'm not sure the dividing line is age, although it probably looks like that when you're seeing people teaching. It might appear like that a bit more. But I think that it comes down to having a reason to engage. So the trouble is that not many people want to learn technology for the sake of learning technology. I mean, that's kind of my heritage, and that's sort of early web, earlier computing sort of heritage. But ultimately, you can't just say, "Hey, old person, technology is cool. Do some of that," right? Because it doesn't have any meaning to it. So I think what you have to do is you have to show that person who might be skeptical kind of case studies, examples, real examples in context of how technology can improve, or extend, or change, or evolve the way that they teach, and make it relevant to their practice. So if they're skeptical of technology, their practice is likely to be predominantly face-to-face, and they're going to be interested in extending that practice, in finding new ways of engaging with students, and that's what you need to show them. So instead of saying, "Hey, get on Twitter," you say, "You could use Twitter like this." And then I think you're more likely to get some traction. But it's a difficult thing to do because people can be quite nervous about getting stuck in. And a lot of people, they have this kind of traditional learning paradigm where they want to learn how to use something before they start. And as we know, there's not really that much point in learning Twitter before you start. You just do it as you go along, and sometimes that can be a barrier as well, that sort of experiential nature to it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I was just thinking while you were answering that, I was thinking about if you were to share your own kind of where you fall on resident, visitor, spectrum sort of thing, just to show these people that you're trying to convince that not everything that we do, it puts us in that resident mode, right? There's still a lot of things we do in that visitor mode, which maybe I think people that maybe don't necessarily understand what people do on Twitter or what people do on different sites assume that everybody's in that resident mode.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things that I tend to find from people that are wary of the resident mode is that they imagine that everything that's at the resident end of the spectrum is just narcissists parading themselves about in front of strangers, right? And they don't really, and one of the reasons for that is because obviously if you're not part of communities, in a resident mode, all you see is the hyper-visible residents. So you get this really twisted view of what's going on out there. Because in some ways, all you see is the narcissists. And perhaps you don't necessarily have a kind of a proper understanding of this kind of thing that we're doing now, for example, which is kind of resident for us in the Hangout and kind of sort of elegant lurking for everybody else.
Yeah. Okay. Heather, do you want to ask another question there?
Sure. We had this one from Lokish and others are wondering how you get students to use internet resources effectively in developing countries or regions where this is a limited resource, and how do you get teachers to embrace it in these situations?
Well, I mean, my understanding of that kind of territory would be that the limited resource is connectivity, so I think that that's the primary kind of blocker. It's not an area that I know an awful lot about, but I think, you know, one of the really interesting stories in this kind of territory was that I was invited to speak at the Wikimania conference, which is the international conference for Wikipedia, this summer, and I got invited to a really strange reception at St. James's Palace, of all places, where there were all like fancy people there. Anyway, Jimmy Wales was talking about how he often goes to third world countries and negotiates with the internet service providers that they will provide Wikipedia with no data charges, which is a pretty incredible thing to do, I think. And I think that's typical of the kind of fundamental thing that needs to happen to really kind of almost explode this area in terms of content and availability to resources. Because it's easy to forget, because we're used to having kind of, you know, unlimited broadband and all of the rest of it. In actual fact, the connectivity model in a lot of third world countries is you pay by the megabyte. Now, imagine what an incredible thing it would be if your school had a couple of computers in it and you knew that you could look at as much of Wikipedia as you wanted without it costing you anything. I mean, that's like taking the largest library in the world and dropping it into a school that hasn't had, you know, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible what that might do. So I think that I think there's probably much less skepticism towards non-traditional sources in places where information's really scarce, and I think it's connectivity that's key there. Did that answer the question?
I think it gave it an interesting perspective. I mean, connectivity is clearly the problem. And you're right, if we can get some alternative, or not alternative, but sources that frequently here in higher ed, there's not a lot of weight put behind. If we, even access like that for people is fabulous. But I had people who said they couldn't watch your videos in the course, which aren't very long, because where they are, they can't watch videos that long.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, a video is a pretty heavy piece of media, isn't it? I mean, just as an example around that, I was careful to provide a transcript on most of those, if you see what I mean. So I think there are those things that you can do. So if you're producing content, you can be sensitive to those issues. So hypothetically, you can get at the kind of goodness of the content, even if you're not watching it in its original mode. And I know that when we were running fully online distance courses, we'd also have the issue of certain services not being available to certain countries. So if our course was based around YouTube, there were some people that just couldn't go to YouTube because it was locked.
Yeah.
So, you know, as soon as education goes global, there are these kind of cultural, techno-cultural sensitivities, and there's normally a way around it. You just have to remember that they exist.
Right.
Okay.
Just before you go, Ryan, let me just remind people that if you want to send in any questions on Twitter, be sure to use the hashtag ILT_USask. There you go.
All right. Here's a question from Jennifer that I thought was pretty interesting. It asks if there is any correlation, or if you know of any correlation between personality types and the types of people that feel more comfortable as residents. So if there's been any studies with like Myers-Briggs or anything like that, comparing it to visitors and residents.
Yeah, that isn't something that I mean, that's something that's always in the background of my mind, because you'd imagine that it would map, And I suspect there's probably elements of that. But as I say, because residency is a bit more subtle than it first appears to be, it's not necessarily that if you're extroverted, you're going to be in resident mode all the time, and if you're introverted, you're going to be visitor mode all the time. Although I'm sure that there's elements of that. One of the things that I'm looking at the moment, which I think is very relevant to education, is in actual fact it doesn't relate to personality type so much, but into the underlying philosophy you have with regards to education. So what you think education is actually appears to have a really big effect on how resident or not you choose to be. So for example, and this came out really in the early days, and it's something that we're exploring in more detail now, is that if you think education is about, you know, you and a book and that idea of the author or the expert, and the idea that study is a private individual thing and that there's a world of knowledge that you dig into and kind of consume, you're likely to be really comfortable in visitor modes. Now, if you think that learning is something that you can be part of, if you think you can contribute to the discourse, if you think you can contribute to the kind of knowledge in a particular area, if you believe that the kind of substance of learning comes out through discourse and connection, then you're likely to be much more interested in the resident mode. Now, if you think about education sort of historically, it's basically geared in a visitor mode, partly because there was very little else in a pre-networked world. So quite a lot of people are quite aligned to that, and I have, you know, quotes from students. Well, I got a quote from a student. So this is the difference between education and learning, to my mind, which is quite intriguing. I got a quote from a student that says, I wouldn't use Wikipedia for my education, but I read it all the time to find out more about things I'm interested in. Okay, so you know, this is and one of the things that fascinates me about that is how a lot of students define learning as what they do in formal context, but when they're finding out about stuff that they just happen to be interested in, that's not learning because they're interested in it. Okay, which is a bit sad. So coming back to the question, I suspect there is some kind of correlation. It's not something I've looked into. I think in some ways it's almost more pertinent to think about it in terms of what you think education is and what you think it means to know and what you think it means to engage. And that's shifting. Certainly in higher education, that's shifting, you know. And so I think resident modes of knowledge, resident modes of engaging are becoming slowly more legitimate. But ultimately, you then have to write a 3-hour exam in a room on your own. So, you know, how far has it come, really?
Yeah.
I'll stop there on that one.
Okay. I don't know if you guys can see when people have sent in questions via the Hangout, but this one is from Sid Harth. And
okay.
He asks, distance education typically suffers from a lack of engagement leading to low completion rates. Do learners have to be residents for online education to be effective?
Okay, well now that's the big, I mean that's the $64 gazillion question, I think. And I think that's really a question that in terms of education and technology we really need to be looking at. So it's a good question. Let's find out if I've got a good answer. I think that in some ways that question, the reality of what's going on and the nature of that question is very much embodied in kind of MOOC land. So if we think about the original connectivist MOOCs, they were literally that connectivist. You'd get people piling together into like Blackboard Collaborate, or it wasn't Hangouts at the time, but this kind of technology, having a good old chat, very resident, okay, and throwing around knowledge. You know, they would always be, those connectivist MOOCs were always in disciplinary territories where, as Dave Cormier says, knowledge is a moving target. So there was no right answer. It was very much in the discourse, and they'd have that discourse, and the people who turned up, you know, were comfortable that they were legitimate participants in that discourse, you know, and that they were creating knowledge, not just eating it, like I was saying before. And then you've got the X-MOOCs, which to me were only radical in terms of their potential business model, but pedagogically weren't radical. I think they were also sort of radical in the way that they widened access as well, which is a good thing. But you have to ask the question, you know, how do you survive an ex-MOOC? And the answer is you survive it by having learnt how to do higher education and having all those tools of the trade. Okay, and when you look at the statistics on the people who complete the big MOOCs, it tends to be people who've already got degrees or masters. They've already got that kind of educational equipment to help them get through it. So one of the things that I'm really intrigued by and that I'd like to be able to explore further is what I call conversation at scale, which is, to what extent can you use the technology to design in ways of engaging large numbers of people? Okay, so it's relatively easy for us three in here to chat with each other, but in actual fact, the Hangout on air is in broadcast mode. Okay, apart from you've got back channels. So there's a sense that perhaps we're having a conversation at scale, but there's also a sense that actually it's a bit like we're on television and you're watching it at home. Do you see what I mean? And I think that the really big question that we should be looking at in this area is, what methods can you use to engage people, more than 10 people at a time in a kind of piece of discourse? Is it hashtags? Is it, everybody piles into a Blackboard Collaborate room? Is it that you use really like Canvas and you're folding all these things in, or does that just break apart? To what extent does the technology hypothetically allow us to do that? Or has it conned us? I wonder whether technology's conned us, because we're so used to these big numbers where you say, oh, there's 20,000 people on a MOOC. Well, what does that really mean? Are they actually connected with each other or not? And I wonder whether the limiting factor is, the technology might have outstripped us. I wonder whether the limiting factor is actually us. And as human beings, we're only capable of having discourse at a certain scale, otherwise it all goes blurry around the edges. I don't think we've cracked it. Pedagogically, I really don't think we've figured that out yet. I think we've got very good at delivering curricular content straight down the line. We're getting better at this sort of thing, but that idea of discourse or conversation at scale is where it's at, and I've experimented with it. So in answer to your question, I think that's the important area, and that we haven't figured it out, and that's what makes it interesting.
Okay. Ryan, you've got another one?
Sure. So this one came from Nancy in the course, and she said, you noted that it can take years to develop comfort with residency, to develop an online voice, and mentioned that there are always ways to onion skin learners' approach to residency and become more expressive online. She's just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about those ideas.
Okay, yeah. I think this is an interesting and slightly contentious area in some ways. So at my institution, for example, we've got our own blogging platform. And every time we talk about it, somebody says, what's the point of having a blogging platform that's inside an institution? Why don't you just do it on WordPress? And every time somebody else says, well, you can't just do it out there on WordPress, because how would we know what was going on, and it's too scary for the students? Okay. So my approach, which is where I'm talking about the onion skinning, is that I believe that higher education should provide safe spaces, but then transition out onto the web, so that you're not just throwing students out on the web. I think blogging is a great example of that. I think one of the nice things about our we've got an e-portfolio system called Mahara, and because lots of people do very visual things in my institution, what's really nice about that is, in terms of that onion skinning between private and completely out there hyper-resident on the web, we give the students the option as to how fast through the onion skinning they are, and I think that's part of the secret of it, is allowing the right people the control to spread what they're doing or to make it more resident. So by default it's private, and you build up your little space, and then you can share your stuff with your cohort, and then you can share it within the institution, and then you can put it completely out online just by clicking a pull down. And to me, that's a really good example of that kind of smooth transition out online. And I just think that in some ways this mirrors the kind of the whole kind of remit of higher education, which is that students come in, if they come in from school, they don't necessarily know their place in the world, they don't necessarily have a sense of themselves as learners or professionals, and the point of certainly an undergraduate degree is to nurture students through to the point where they do feel like they can go out into the world and feel like they are, somebody who can participate in a particular sphere. And to me, the way that we use technology should mirror that, and that we should gradually sort of make things more and more open until perhaps when you're in the first term of your third year, you find you're operating openly online. But you're sort of comfortable with that because you sort of know that the things that you're saying, while they might not be totally cutting edge, are actually, you know the field a little bit, you know the discourse, you know who to connect to, what to talk about, and you just gradually build up that confidence. So I think blogging, certain forms of e-portfolio work there. I think using Wikipedia as a place where you edit and add to or create new pages is a fantastic way of doing that because it's not too identity linked. Do you know what I mean? You're still slightly anonymous with that, and then you can say, "Hey, I wrote that page. It's fantastic." You know, it's assuming it doesn't get deleted in 20 seconds. I think even just going around like commenting on news sites, or you can start by perhaps getting a network of people in Twitter, but not getting involved in the discussion, and then gradually getting involved in this discussion as you get more confidence. There's loads of ways of doing it. But it's that sense of a kind of smooth transition, which in some ways has to be part of a pedagogical design that perhaps spans 3 years or more, which is not necessarily something we're that good at, that kind of total student journey, but I think we're getting better at it.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I have a question here from Oksana. This is a little long, but it's a good question. David, is there any research that has been done on establishing a relationship between the results of the visitors and residents mapping activity done with the instructor and the students of a fully online course and the level of instructor and or student satisfaction with that course in terms of the level of social interaction?
Okay, let me try and get that into my head. The simple answer is no, but if you want to fund me to do it. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting. I mean, implicit in that question is the idea that if you're doing a fully online course and people are engaging in a resident fashion, then perhaps that makes them, you know, more engaged and more satisfied in the course. Certainly, with fully online distance courses I've been involved in, that social element to it and that sort of pastoral edge to it as well, in terms of people tutoring, does make a big difference in terms of engagement. And I think you're kind of onto something there, because you know when you go to the physical institution, if you're on a face-to-face course, you get the thing about attending physical classes is you get a sense of belonging for free because you just happen to be sat next to people. Do you know what I mean? Even if you don't know the people around. I use the example of going to the cinema. So you go to the cinema and you sit down and you still get that feeling of fellowship, of being part of a group, even though you're in the dark and you're all experiencing the same thing at the same time, and that's very powerful. I think with a fully online distance course, unless you employ some kind of resident modes of engagement, then it's very easy to become dislocated. And I know people who've said to me, well, I did this online course and it was in a subject that I loved, but I ended up dropping out because I didn't feel like I was part of anything. All I was doing was going to this place and consuming content. Again, that's something that we're getting better at, but I think it's something that we could do more in that area. And we found in the courses that I used to run that the biggest single factor was the tutor. So if the tutor was kind of socially engaging, then students tended to love the course. And if the tutor was kind of distant and just kind of prodded the forums from a distance in a fairly sort of neutral way, then students found it difficult to engage in the course. There's a reason why we have teachers, okay? It's something that I come back to all the time, because you know we've got public libraries, so why do we have teachers? It's kind of a response I make when people say, oh, well, now we've got Wikipedia and the web, we don't need universities. I'm like, yeah, but we had libraries for hundreds of years, and somehow we needed schools, and right? So I suppose if I'm going to answer that question other than no, then my answer would be I think it hangs very much on the way the teacher chooses to operate and how kind of engaged and how resident they are. And that's quite a subtle technique when you're doing that online as compared to face-to-face, because nothing comes for free when you're online. You've got to work at it harder. I'll stop there.
Okay. I got a question here, and I think we've kind of already hit on some of these things. This one's from Celia, and it mentions that the, students at her institution complete a certified distance learning course in 8 weeks. She's wondering, is 8 weeks long enough to change kind of their cultural motivations in terms of visitor and resident? And then she also asks, are there instances when a visitor mode of learning would be more appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what the course is on and what kind of accreditation it's going towards, how many people are on the course, and the kind of pedagogic design of the course. But 8 weeks is plenty long enough to give people a sense of, you know, residency. I think that the key thing, as I was sort of alluding to earlier about resident modes, is they're experiential. So there's no point in sitting around on a course talking about what's it like in Facebook. You've just got to get in there, okay? There's no point in talking about what would it be like if I made a video and then people commented on it. You've got to do it, right? And so I think if you've got 8 weeks and each week you're being challenged to do something experiential. So in a course that I'm designing, I've got, you know, a couple of things. I got told off for this anyway, but I had vandalize a Wikipedia page and find out how long before you get told off or it gets repaired, right? Because it's really, really experiential. I had another one which I think would be really difficult, but I'd like to experiment with, which would be create an alt profile and pretend to be a different character and see how long you can sustain that for. Because my theory is that not many people can sustain it for very long. But these are the kind of mechanisms that you could use that are very experiential, that would at least give people a sense of what it means to be resident and whether people felt it was of value to them. The single biggest factor, I think, in terms of whether people kind of engage with residency is when they get something back. So if you tweet and then somebody replies, or if you tweet and somebody who you've never even heard of replies, then you know you're getting something back from the void. If you blog and somebody comments, then you suddenly go, oh, I get this, okay? I've got kind of an audience, I've got a network. And you have to kind of feel that. It has to be a legitimate activity. You can't just say, oh, it's really nice when somebody comments on your post. It has to be you, because it's all about the individual, that sense of residency. So 8 weeks is long enough. But visitor mode is often more effective. And if we're talking about, you know, courses that head towards a traditional form of assessment, then you'll probably find the students in predominantly visitor mode get the most out of the course in terms of how they do in the assessment. The question you've got to ask yourself is, if you stay only in visitor mode, will you get the most out of the course in a larger sense, in terms of all of the things that you learn that you wouldn't have otherwise learned, or all of the people that you connect to that you wouldn't have otherwise connected to, or that network that you start building up. And of course, in higher education, institutions are starting to get more and more interested in the idea that if their students leave, you know, when their students graduate, if they've got a network that they've already built, the chances of them being successful in the world are much higher. So I think that visitor mode is very good at getting you through that traditional curriculum, because basically courses are still predominant. But if you want to be successful during your time in higher education or education, then some resident activity is actually really important and increasingly important. And I think a lot of students recognize that. I think a lot of institutions recognize it, but they're just not quite sure to what extent they can support and facilitate students in that. So it's a difficult area at the moment, but it's shifting quite quickly.
Yeah, I think your point on kind of the assessment or the the intended outcomes for the course, right, make a big difference in terms of if we want students to move out of the visitor mode or not.
Yeah, and on that point, I mean, there's a reason why institutions operate the way that they do, and there's two major elements to it. One is quantifying achievement, which means that you have to design assessments that allow you to quantify how well people have done against each other. They have to be relatively objective. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is how education works. And the other one is the fact that a heck of a lot of people do a course at a time, scale. Okay, so one of the difficulties with resident mode is if your form of assessment is highly resident, like write a blog post and we'll comment on it and then we'll decide what that means, that's a very, very fluid and subjective environment for students to be in. And human beings like to be given a number, and they like to know whether that number is bigger or smaller than the person next to them. So whatever anybody says about education and truth and beauty and you know, the inspiration and creativity, at the end of the day, everybody quite likes a number, and we're all really closely tied to that, which is why I think the future is probably that sense of sort of visitor mode quantifiable assessments, but with this layer of residency which has to do with the way that you are in the world through your learning, rather than just I'm going to get a piece of paper. I think that's how it's going to go. Cheers.
We had a question on Twitter from Linda, and she said, I wonder if there's an optimum number or proportion of residents in a network to make it function. And I kind of, is this sort of a Dunbars number thing?
It could be, yeah. I mean, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I actually got to meet Dunbar and talk to him at length when I was at Oxford, which was fantastic. I felt like I was with like a kind of academic superstar. I mean, just to be, I mean, you know, again, it's not that they're residents, it's that they're operating in that resident mode and they're comfortable in operating in that resident mode. We had a basic rule of thumb in the courses that we used to do that we wouldn't run them if there was less than 11 people on them. We used to run cohorts of between 11 and 30 because that was optimal for the way we designed the course. And because we felt you couldn't get a critical mass of discourse. I think that the Dunbar number is quite interesting from that point of view. And one of the things that I found intriguing, which might have faded off a little bit, but maybe it hasn't, is that, you know, if you're in a lecture theatre, the expectation is that maybe 2 or 3 people will ask a question, and then maybe sort of 18 people will be really engaged but won't talk, and then maybe 50 people will be sort of half paying attention, and everybody else will be asleep. Okay. Whereas when learning moved online, we suddenly had this kind of thing that unless 100% of the people were 100% engaged, it was a massive failure. And I don't know why we imagined that the system had to change. I think it's, again, something to do with things that come for free in the physical world. Because you get this sense, if you can look out over a bunch of students, they're kind of there. But when you're in an online space, you don't get that. So unless they say something, you feel like they haven't even attended. So I think that what in terms of that question, I think what you have to do is think around that Dunbar number, which is, let's say the edge of the number is 150, but it has the concentric circles, and say within any group a certain percentage will be really engaged and really vocal. And then there'll be another ring round that they'll occasionally chip in, and there's another ring round that where they'll elegantly lurk, and there's another ring round that where they'll be disengaged. And I think we just have to have that kind of expectation of the courses we run if they're in online spaces, even if we set them up to be highly resident. And we shouldn't have the expectation that just because we're doing things online with a certain type of people, that there'll be any higher level of engagement in terms of modes than there would be offline. And again, I think this comes back to the art of the teacher, in that it's the teacher's job to try and make that central circle as big as possible, and to try and make that, you know, the 4 people that are always talking into 7 people that are always talking, or to, you know, put a lid on people like me that never stop talking and encourage the quieter people. So I think, again, this is very, very much where the role of the teacher comes in to make that successful. Throw a bunch of strangers into a room, it's going to be awkward. You know, it's the same online. You need somebody there to get it going.
Right.
All right, Heather, you can go again. You have another question?
Sure. Actually, this question was from Joe, and the question had to do with, do you think it's a good idea that institutions, whether higher ed or K-12, have rules or policies around the use of technology? And my follow-up to that would be, what role do you think they're playing in whether people are visitors or students and instructors are visitors or residents?
Yeah, the policies business is interesting. I mean, there are places that have like social media policies, and then you're sort of like, well, giving everybody an internet connection, I mean, you know, it's game over. I mean, what are you expecting? So I think that it's, I think the tricky. So in terms of that idea of to what extent can institutions kind of influence that sort of where people sit on the continuum, where they're comfortable, I think they can have a massive influence. But the way that they can go about doing that is perhaps not as immediately obvious it might appear to be. You know, most people, a lot of people will have resident modes of engagement outside of that formal institutional context. So they might be in Facebook groups, or they might chat with people on Skype. But as soon as they come into the institution, they perhaps don't feel that those modes of engagement are legitimate because they're not what education's about. And they feel, you know, when you ask students that are at school, hey, what do you think is going to change when you go to university? They basically describe an institution that's 70 years out of date, and they say, well, I'm going to have to get off Facebook and sit in the library and read a book, right? Which we know doesn't happen, but it's just intriguing, isn't it? And so I think that what the most elegant way that institutions can perhaps encourage more resident activity is to host a conversation with students and say, hey, you know, some of those things that you do outside of the institutional context, because we know you've got Facebook groups about the course and stuff like that, that's all good. Those kind of activities that you're doing where you're collaborating, you're chatting, you're forming groups, those are all good. And here's some advice on how you can do them better. We don't want to own that. We don't want to take control of it. We don't want to stick our logo on it. We don't want to necessarily even provide the technology beyond the Wi-Fi and bring your own device to actually help you with that. But as the institution, we're saying those things are actually pretty good, and you should incorporate them into your learning. Because, you know, one of the things I talk about is the learning black market, and I think that what happens is because institutions present almost by accident this very particular mode of learning, an awful lot of students' personal learning practices, the students are nervous that they're not legitimate, even when they're actually quite good. So the institution can kind of encourage those practices by just saying, hey, that stuff's okay, you know, that's fine, and that's a massive validation. I think sometimes in institutions we underestimate how important that is, and then the students are just more comfortable with the way that they're sort of combining or crossing over their practices, which might be quite resident in the kind of personal quadrant, with the way that they're operating in and out of the institution, and they can bring all of those kind of practices into their learning without feeling like somebody's going to go, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be doing that. That's plagiarism, or that's cheating, or that's collusion. When in actual fact, it's collaboration, it's discourse, it's sharing in a very, very healthy way. So that is how I think that can be approached in a very pragmatic sort of manner that would actually, I believe, have quite a big impact. Finding ways of convening that discussion is quite difficult, because I've found I sit down and go, I'm a researcher, tell me about how you go about learning. Most students won't tell me half of it because I still represent the institution, even in a research context. So it's difficult.
Right.
Just kind of thinking about that, we've done some work here at the U of S around trying to get instructors to use Twitter in their courses and things like that. And I think when you do that, it kind of opens up, kind of showing that these other ways of learning are okay, right? As the instructor goes on Twitter and starts sharing, Wikipedia links or different things like that, then it can get students starting to see that, oh, the content doesn't just come from the instructor, right? There is content out there, there's videos out there. Yeah. All of these normal ways that I go about learning things can be legitimate. And I think that is a way to kind of help facilitate that.
Yeah, and absolutely, and certainly, every time we've done any research looking at student experience, the biggest single factor is the way that the tutor operates. So as soon as the tutor does it, it's legitimate. Mm-hmm. It's that simple. But encouraging tutors to change their practices is quite a big ask. It's quite a big thing to actually ask to require of them. But absolutely, and one shared link from a tutor from Wikipedia will completely reshape how students feel about that whole area.
All right, I'm going to ask a question here from Susan in the course. She was wondering, when you kind of do this work, what different understandings people have of public or open. So in some students' eyes, posting to a closed tutor group from within like an LMS, they might consider that to be public, where right others obviously wouldn't think of that as public. But people have a lot different kind of understandings in terms of what's meant by posting something public or posting something on the kind of open web. Kind of what sort of issues do you run into with that?
Yeah, it's one of these things about the web that is really challenging because it's like a completely imagined space. And I think that people that are really comfortable or really adept at being in that resident mode, I think, personally, I think those people have the ability to create a kind of the landscape of you know, the different services and the different people who are in different locations and how they flow into each other. I think they can create a kind of mental landscape, a sort of mental social landscape of what's happening when they're posting things to certain places. And I think other people just find it very difficult to realize that because it is completely abstract. There's a really great project called the Internet Mapping Project by, I can't remember his name anyway, it's on Flickr, where he just asks people to, you get this piece of paper and it just says, draw a picture of the internet and indicate where your home is. And the variation in interpretations from like server farms to just squiggles with faces just demonstrates how the massive range of perceptions of how people perceive what's going on in the virtual. Because ultimately we have to kind of spatialize it. We have to create a map in our mind. For me personally, it's the reason why I'm either completely private, you know, one-to-one, or completely open, because I'm not capable of managing anything in between, because I can't remember who's there and I'll say the wrong thing in the wrong place. So basically, I've got two modes. I get some things that I can say to the entire world, or things that I can only say to one other person. So I think, and nothing in between. And so far I haven't messed that up. But and I think, as you say, students will have different perceptions. I think it very much comes down to this idea of belonging and to the idea, again, that I come back to of whether you feel like you've got a legitimate voice. And again, that comes back to the tutor or the teacher's ability to sort of, you know, nurture students into feeling like they've got the right to say something to a certain group of people. Okay, everybody suffers from imposter syndrome. And they suffer at it at different levels, and in a way you've got to come up through the layers. So there'll be a point where saying something out loud in a class or in a forum, you're like, well, I can't say this, I don't know what I'm talking about. And then you'll gradually gain enough confidence to be able to, you know, talk within that forum, and then once you're comfortable in that forum, you might be able to go to a larger forum. So you could argue that it's kind of a form of social, communicative onion skinning again. And I think, in answer to the question, you just have to be, I mean, you know, you're right to identify it, and you just have to be sensitive towards it. And some people will be comfortable to go further faster. So, you know, I've always been confident at speaking. I was quite happy to say something even if I didn't know whether it was right, because I felt like that was part of the process of discourse. And I think, again, that's very important, is trying to create an environment where you're saying the point is not about being right. The point is about moving forward the discourse and the debate. But again, you know, most incoming students' mindset will be, I'm not going to mention anything unless I'm correct, and that's driven by that classic kind of, you know, knowledge transfer essay. You know, where the point at which you found that you weren't right is when you failed the course, which always seemed a little bit strange to me. And so if you want to kind of nurture people into being comfortable in ever increasingly open environments, I really think you have to promote the idea that the point of the exercise is not being right. Difficult in certain disciplines, but generally speaking, you can find a way of doing that. You know, some of the, you could say, harder disciplines where there is a correct answer, you need to then form your pedagogy so that that correct answer is actually not the focus, but it's just a kind of part of a larger thing that you're doing in terms of, and good teachers have always been good at that, you know.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to make sure I'm getting to questions we haven't already done. And we might have covered some of this, but this was from Patricia, and it was just a very straightforward question about how can you encourage a visitor to become a resident. And I know that that's not always necessary, but how?
Yeah. You know, one of the things when we're doing this visitor resident mapping process that I find quite encouraging is that quite often we have people coming on those mapping sessions and they're very much in a visitor mode, and they go away from the mapping session and they go, oh, I don't need to be a resident. You know, actually, in the context of what I'm doing, visitor mode is appropriate, and I'm going to get better at doing that. So there's definitely that element to it. Again, I think if you want people to kind of shift, if you feel that that's the object of the exercise, then, you know, we did this thing around transition points. You know, what are the factors that tend to most likely tip people going from visitor to resident? Interestingly, with students, the biggest single factor we could identify was if they'd moved state or if they'd moved country, because they wanted to stay in contact with a community of people that they were now geographically a long way from. And so they immediately got into Skype and they immediately got into Facebook because it was a way of maintaining relationships. Even to the extent that I had a student who'd come over from China would blog about her day, because it was the most efficient way that she could tell her extended family and friends what was going on in her life, and then they'd talk about it. So it was, you know, and that functions very well. The second biggest factor was social exclusion. So, and that's the kind of rubbish one, but it definitely exists, whereby the people suddenly realized that they were missing out on an entire slice of life because they weren't in Facebook or in Twitter. So they join reluctantly and then get sucked into it. And then the more interesting one was whereby, you know, up until a certain point, probably most of your resident engagement will be social, personal. But then suddenly somebody starts a group that's about the course, and you join that group. And suddenly when you go into Facebook, the occasional message is about your course. And so suddenly your practices haven't changed, but what you're seeing is gradually shifting from the personal to the institutional, from the personal to learning, kind of from under your feet, you know. And as you go through university, that becomes more and more. And then you get to this interesting juncture whereby you shift from social peer group to building a kind of network that can work for you. And you start friending people, not because you're friends with them, but because you know they're a good student. And you know that when they're talking about certain sources, they're the good sources. And that's when you're shifting from that kind of everybody's best friends and, you know, let's talk about the party, to actually, you're going to be of use to me, that's why I'm going to connect to you. And that's where the network starts to change and evolve. And I think that that can be a very, you know, sliding thing. Certainly happened for me with Twitter. It's entirely social to begin with. And then it gradually became more and more professional, and you can see that happening as people get jobs. Is that things sort of transition down across the map. And now I'm sort of in a slightly sad position whereby sometimes I'm wary of putting personal things into Twitter, so I need to find somewhere else to do personal resident things. Mm-hmm. So I think these are some of the key factors that you see people transitioning over. But again, it just comes back about making it relevant and making it clear what the potential value would be, and sort of creating activities that feel authentic to students, rather than saying, here's how to do an @reply, here's how to do a retweet. You know, you have to say, let's get in there, let's have a chat around this hashtag, you can see how you feel about it. And people decide for themselves, you know.
Right.
Okay, I've got another one here, kind of a big question. And I think we're getting close to the end, so I think it's a good question near the end here. We talked earlier about how you say how people kind of perceive visitor, resident, how mapping that to how they kind of perceive education, or the purpose of education. Mm-hmm. So this is a question from Sherry in the course. Says, do you think it is important for educators to learn or experience residents to be effective in the higher education system of today?
So the question is kind of saying, if you're teaching, do you need to have a feel for what residency is to be effective?
I think so.
Yeah. And I think, again, that comes back to how you characterize effective. And I think, again, that comes back to, is effective getting a good mark, or is effective going out into the world equipped to do what you want to do? Mm-hmm. And that's probably where the dividing line is. I'd say that understanding the potential value of residency, building a network, engaging in Discord, all of these things as a teacher, I can't see how that can't be a good thing. But it's coming back to what you were saying earlier, it's quite a difficult thing to promote unless you're doing it yourself. People are wary of social or quasi-social practices. If you say, hey, go and do that quasi-social thing over there, I don't do it, I think it's crazy, but you should do it, it just doesn't wash. So, being aware of it is probably useful to a certain extent, but I think unless you're actually, engaged in a certain way, then it's not really going to appear authentic. And then you get questions like, one of the questions that intrigues me, is it possible to be a 9-to-5 resident? Or do you have to end up with this completely decompartmentalized life whereby every time you go online you might be doing something personal or something professional? Have we completely broken down all those barriers? I think it probably is possible to be a 9-to-5 resident. I think it's possible to engage as a teacher in resident modes and still be able to kind of control and manage the way that you engage with students. But you have to kind of set certain expectations in terms of how quickly you're likely to respond, or when you're going to be on or when you're not going to be on. And sometimes that field trip or surgery metaphor works well, like the hashtag discussions where you say, I'll be here, I'll be in this space, which happens to be Facebook or Twitter or somewhere else, for this time to have a chat around that hashtag. I think that works well as well. So in answer to the question, yeah, I think it's just got to be useful, but unless they're enacting that practice themselves, it's not going to go that far.
Okay, I see that there is one more question that just came in on Twitter.
Okay.
Maybe we'll ask that. So this one's from Linda, and she asks about if there are any accessibility issues, meaning say somebody who's dyslexic, are they more likely to act as a visitor versus a resident?
Oh, I think that's a really good point. One of the intriguing things about the web is how it's actually foregrounded textual engagement. Do you know what I mean? It's made everything back to writing. Or the predominant mode is text, which is sort of ironic. And I do think that if you find it difficult to express yourself in text, then you'll struggle in resident modes. Obviously there are plenty of other ways. We're demonstrating it now. But somehow, somewhere in there, there's a kind of textual underpinning to how you express yourself as a resident. So I can see that as being a disadvantage. Now, some of that comes down to whether you're operating in an asynchronous or a synchronous mode, I think. So, IM chats are a nightmare for people that can't type quickly. And we all know when we've done like educational instant message chats, what happens is they get faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. Somebody writes a massive paragraph. By the time they hit enter, the thing's moved on, and it's just like boom, straight in the middle, and and then everybody's just exhausted. Okay, so I think that can be really tough. If you're doing something in a discussion forum where you say the forum's open for 2 days, then I think that can actually be a massive advantage to people who are perhaps dyslexic, for example, or have accessibility issues, or significantly, the language of the course isn't their first language. So I think that it very much depends how you design in the technology. One of the things that interests me is the success of what I call not quite real time. So something like a Facebook wall or Twitter, whereby it's much slower than a conversation, but it's still sort of real time, and it's in this beautiful middle ground whereby if you're not the person who can formulate your thoughts like that, which you have to do in a face-to-face discussion, you can still really get stuck in. So what I'm trying to say is that you've got 30 or 40 seconds or maybe a minute or two to formulate a short response. Everybody can look intelligent, right? Just long enough to swing by Wikipedia and come back in and go, oh yeah, it's definitely this. So I think that a really powerful area, and if you think about how social media operates, that not quite real time, which really doesn't exist anywhere except for on the web, is a really, really enabling sort of form of communication, because it's live enough that you feel like you're connected and you're part of something, but it's just slow enough that you can get your act together if you're not that guy who's always answering the questions because he just happens to think quick.
Right.
How are we doing?
I think we are just about at time.
Okay.
We've had some great questions, and this has been a fabulous discussion. I want to thank you very much for joining us today, taking the time to do this. This has been wonderful.
Is that me? Are you talking to me, or are you talking
Yes,
to
I'm
everybody?
talking to you.
Oh, that's fine. I'd like to extend that to everybody or whoever might be out there.
And the recording of this will be up soon, right after this ends. I think it automatically goes to YouTube, and it'll be in the same place in the course that it was before, or at the same link that we shared on Twitter. And that's it. Our next talk, we don't have another chat until, is it when next week, Ryan?
I think it might be Monday. I think it's.
I think it's Monday, and we're talking about digital citizenship on Monday. So you might want to look ahead and get going on that if you're in the course. Otherwise, thank you again for joining us. It's been fabulous, and David, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, excellent.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.